is the Fat Man GM, revisiting Iron Crown Enterprises Middle-earth role-playing game system from the 80s and 90s. This particular installment is the Lost Realm of Cardolan. Please bear with me if I don't quite pronounce it the way you might pronounce it, or others may pronounce it. Cardolan is an interesting piece of territory. It's actually quite an important chunk of Arnor, or former Arnor. It's one of the three breakaway kingdoms. The first one, or the second one, to fall to the Witch King Arnor and the Dark Forces late in the later years, long before this all takes place. Of course, many centuries before the War of the Rings. Cardolan itself is located in southeastern Arnor, and it straddles the road that leads to Gondor by way of the Rohan Pass, or what will eventually become the Rohan Pass. The country itself is in part the breadbasket of Arnor. The upper northern sections of it borders on what in the War of the Rings era would be the Shire. It also contains most of the Barrow Downs and is the subject of a lot of intense fighting, even back when it was the days of Arnor, when the Arnorian kings and their subjects were dealing with the Dunlandings to the south. And of course, the book itself will cover Tharbad, Blondir Ennis, and Barad Garithian. Otherwise, Tharbad, the greatest surviving work of the Normarines, Blondir Ennis and Alderaun's ancient seaport, and Baradad Garithian's mighty tower of the great houses of Cardolan. In some ways, Tharbad and the areas around it probably remind me of more traditional fantasy settings like Dungeons and Dragons than it does the traditional Lord of the Rings kind of setting. Just saying, it seems that way anyway. Can't lower it down any further. Draw it up just a hair more. Nobody wants to see my barely. There we go. Like I said, one of the things I've always liked about Iron Crown Enterprises was when they created MERP, they took it into the assumption that as GMs and as players, you don't always want to use the same system. So they gave us, in pretty much every book, you have this section called conversion, converting stats, converting combat abilities, converting spells and spell lists from one type of system to the next. So in this case, the traditional Iron Crown Enterprises, the traditional MERP is based off of the D100 system, and we have the modifications for the D100. We have modifications for the D20 system, so we could use any of the D20 system rules. So if you wanted to use your Pathfinder rules, or you wanted to use the D&D rules, or Flame Princess rules, assuming they're D20, whatever, you can use those sets of rules and use the background as the campaign world, and it's very easy to do. And then there's of course the six-sided. So we got the D100, the D20, the D6, and the D12 system. I've yet to play a system that uses D12s, but I'm assuming they exist because otherwise, why would you have it? We have our overview talking about, Cardolan comprises all the land between the two great rivers of Eredor, the Baradin, otherwise known as the Brandywine, and the Mithril, extending into in Edrith. Gotta love these long, convoluted names. Thank you, Mr. Tolkien, Professor Tolkien. We got the history of Cardolan, which is part of Arnor, when it becomes the kingdom of itself. Its disasters and the Civil War that really affected its effectiveness in later years. The rise of the Witch King, fall of the kingdom, and then the after. So what it would be like to move through it and operate in it during the years after or before, just before the War of the Ring. And there's after. It's interesting to note that in the novels and in the movies, we rarely briefly touch on it. There's references to it when Boromir arrives in Rivendell. He makes a comment about losing his horse at the crossing at Tharbad. That's the king that would have been the capital of Cardolan at the time, and was crucial because it was both an inland port on a very large section of the Brandywine, and that it was the only location prior to the destruction of Tharbad to have actual bridges constructed to allow commerce and people to easily cross this very wide, shallow, somewhat muddy and shallow river. So the other mention might be once or twice in passing. Also, it is where the Southern Greenway passes through, so that's the locations for the long ride to Gondor. When Gandalf leads the party south, they skirt the mountains, so they actually go in the area to the west of this region, not this region specifically, and that's one of the reasons why they were taking a shortcut from Rivendell, supposedly, which ends up with them entering Moria, which is a different sort of thing. We got a brief timeline, which gives us a good breakdown over the years. So what I like about this breakdown of timelines, it gives us as a GM an opportunity to pick a time for running our campaign. So if we wanted to use this book to run a campaign, we could pick it at any point of the Third Age, some of the Second Age, and a bit of the Fourth Age, and utilize it with just a base amount of information. So if I looked at circa Third Age 1100, the Harefoot hobbits enter Eredor, Valahides and Stores follow within 50 years. The Harefoot settle through in Erdith, and then with the Valahides to the north and Stores to the south. So basically, the hobbits make their way into central Arnor and begin the settlement of the areas around Bree and what becomes to Shire. So you could build a campaign around that if you chose. Think about an all hobbit, all halfling campaign where the adventurers are the vanguard of this colonization effort, and their job is to go in and scout out the area and maybe run off any problems. Just thought, right? And then we have the description, the geography, the land. They do a good job. I've always liked how MERP goes to the little extra efforts. These are, in some people's cases, what they call unnecessary fluff, and I don't agree with that. I think it really sets the tone. This is the backstory for the module or the source book. In this case, this is technically a source book. The climate, Cardolan's ecology, flora, fauna, various things you're going to encounter. The herbivores, birds and flying creatures, reptiles, then we got domestic animals, and then we get into the peoples and cultures. The high men or the Dunedain at Cardolan, which actually in numbers are much smaller numbers than the bulk of the common men that are found, because most of the common men are either from various other tribes from around the Middle Earth, or from the Dunlandings and some of the other local tribes that predominated the area before the arrival of the Dunedain and the Numerians, who then, between them and the elves, kind of civilized them to some degree. I know that this whole region, and especially to the southeast near Holland, is rife with history. Prior to the human settlement and domination of the region, when the settling of Arnor in the years prior when the Numerians were beginning to extend their control over this section of Middle Earth. Way before that, we see many fights and many conflicts between Sauron's forces and the elves. So, and in some degree, the dwarves and the goblins and orcs, and the dwarves and Sauron's forces. And I don't think there's any encounters between the elves and dwarves in a large scale situation in this vicinity. But the point is, this whole area has very deep roots, very far deep back history, and that the humans existed during that entire time. But for the lion's share, their reason why they're hill people is that they stuck to the fringes, and whenever the things really went south, very few of them participated. They weren't Numerians, they weren't high men, so the odds were really against them in any kind of conflict that dealt with the elves and the Dark Lord. If anything, they were more likely to become under the sway of the Dark Lord's forces because they were easily manipulated, in part because their Dunlendings are highly suspicious people, highly tribal, almost barbarian-like in that aspect. And you could easily argue that they were barbarian tribes at that point of the Second Age. But I'm not here to discuss the nuances of the human societies in Middle-earth. The Endorians, which is some of these people I'm talking about, landsmen, the common folk, tribesmen, other races to be found, the Northmen, the Hobbits, the Berfen, wandering elves, the religion. Now, the Berfen would be the equivalent of the wild men of the woods or the woes that we see in Cardolan or Catalhorn, which would later become Rohan, in southeastern corner of it, where it borders with Gondor. And there's a huge chunk of forest that's very primeval, that's located in south central Cardolan, and I think in part that is where you find these people dominating, living in the deep woods. Politics and power, government. So we got the breakdown of this case, the baronies, they call them the Hirador and the Hirador of Turngorthad, the Hirador of Girthan. These would be the baronies. The answer to the princes, which originally were princes and princes of the Arthedain kings, and eventually became kings of their own. So calling them princes were kind of, I think, more due to the fact that somebody else wrote the history. Government. So when the Dunedain kingdom endured, the king's position was generally that of the first among equals among his feudal lords. The king alone had the authority over external affairs and alone could create laws for the land. However, the king had very little control over internal affairs for the princes. By refusing to cooperate, the princes could effectively veto many of the actions of the king. This is one of the reasons that Cardolan had many problems in the years prior to the encounters with the Witch King, and then it just became even worse as the kings the Witch Kings and engagements became more and more prominent. Their internal bickering and the lack of a very centralized government like you would normally see in a monarchy caused them a lot of problems, which eventually in the long run helped see their downfall. And they were used against them. Warcraft, military organizations, warrior classes, the Raggers, lesser-blooded offspring of soldiers of early Numerian garrisons, and the Andorian wives of mistresses were less than welcome in Nuramor, so many of the Trigil took up their father's profession and remained in Cardolan. Over the centuries, to become a primary military class in their land, the steel heart of the forces of Cardolan. They also adopted the epithet hurled at them by Danish marauders as the title of honor, i.e. Raggers, or from Ragcran Sliga, or the ranks of pikes. So basically they're pikemen. They're highly organized and regimented and in large numbers pikes. Pikemen in the day, very tough outfits to overcome. They were almost invincible against cavalry charges, and if worked in great formations, were very tough to break even on a formal battlefield because of the length of their weapons. Very interesting. Warcraft. cavalry, mounted infantry, and militia. Said here in ancient time, lords and lordlings in Arnor fought on foot beside their subjects. The infusion of flying horses by the Northmen were greeted enthusiastically, as marching was somewhat beneath one's dignity. However, the Dunedain nobility were trained to fight on foot, and horses were very expensive at first. Therefore, the tendency among the lesser lords was to protect their horses only by using them as a means to reach the battle. Only the greater lords could be afforded stables and new equipment and the training necessary to fight effectively from horseback. Cardolan never developed a heavy cavalry because that became the mainstays of the Dunedain armies of Arthedain and Gondor. And in defense of that, even in that case, the huge cavalry formations in Gondor or Arnor proper never materialized. They just didn't have the livestock base. They just didn't have the horse numbers to generate a society that was horse driven. We don't. If you look at the Middle Ages of the real world, you can see a number of countries that had much more successes as foot infantry and organizations of that nature. Rome was that situation. Rome had cavalry auxiliaries, but pound for pound, blade for blade, they had a superior number of foot soldiers versus cavalry. They just didn't have the numbers, as opposed to, say, the Mongols, who were nothing but horse lords, and everybody was mounted. So the modern, or the Middle Earth equivalent, the Rohirrim, were totally dependent on horses for combat, and everything they did, from training in youth to formations and tactics, all developed the concept. The only time you ever saw any significant formation of foot soldiers in the Rohirrim was when they'd already suffered a number of conflicts and lost a number of their horses at battle, so they took their fighting effectives, more or less, and grouped them together into formations of foot soldiers that really didn't function well in that aspect. They did not function well because they're not trained and do not train on a regular basis to function as a solid unit, as we do see in the Gondorian and Arnor's armies. So it's an interesting little bit you may or may not care about. The political situation, the economy. Like I said, one of the problems with the Cardolan is that they were constantly fighting amongst themselves, bickering. The princes and the barons in charge always kind of challenged the king at the time, and even prior to the individual kingdoms, the petty kingdoms, being split up by the last king of Arnor, which was a terrible mistake on his part, and it's never been satisfactory explained to me exactly why he did that. What was he thinking? In his mind, the history claims he was thinking to preserve Arnor from a civil war by preventing his three sons from bickering and fighting over it, who was going to be in charge, which was clearly defined by the elder child being the one with the right to rule anyway. He gives them three different sections of the country and basically splits the country in three, and there's the first major downslide to occur, and it's never the same after that. So just inevitable that Arnor is going to disintegrate. So we see roughly size change often very quickly. Pro-Arthedain faction, the Arthedania tend to view the High King of Fornastrain as the traditional front of authority. The Gondorians, so you got a group of people who really see the leadership of Arthedain as the true lords of Arnor and have a tendency to do more lip service towards them than they do their own king. And then you have a group that supports Gondor as being the obvious choice of the replacement of the fall of Arnor, since it's already, as far as some people are concerned, it's already diminished by the fact it's no longer a country by itself, so on and so forth. So you get a lot of internal bickering, which leads to some problems. Another problem when they settled the country, and they focused on one or two locations. There's a town in the south that's a larger seaport, if you will, because that on the river leading to the ocean, and for seagoing vessels, and then Tharbad. Other than those two, there's really no larger communities to spread the wealth, spread the population concentrations. So the majority of the rank and file and the commoners are going to be spread across this wide, grassy, hilly countryside in small thorps and villages and individual farmsteads and manor houses, as opposed to having more sophisticated cultural centers for everything to radiate around. And you can see the development in the real world and in other historical or in other game worlds, if you will, where that really makes a difference. I think this is one of those defining points for me, what defines the difference between sword and sorcery style of gaming and high fantasy. Because if you look at and read Conan the Barbarian series and those of that sword and sorcery bent, where we're going back to really ancient times, and civilizations are rare. Civilized countries are even rarer, and finding huge, large city-states is more likely than finding large, multi-city countries. And so we're going to find a city-state which is surrounded by farmers and farmlands and little villages, and then between those city-states, which might call themselves a country, and the next one is going to be huge, vast, open areas, often unexplored and uninhabited. It's not civilized by any means, maybe speckled here and there with the occasional village or determined farmer and so on and so forth, as opposed to high fantasy and later versions, things like we see in the Forgotten Realms and Dragonlance. Now these are worlds that are heavily settled, heavily civilized in quite large sections of it. So they have these mini countries, but within these mini countries are large cities and small cities and towns, and they're organized, and many of them have roads and communication networks and canals and so on and so forth. The trappings of more complicated civilizations and what's needed on the road to, say, industrialization and to specialization. But there's, once again, something for a different time, I guess. The economy. Talk about the institution, the guilds of Tharbad, fairs and festivals, the princes of Cardolan, the various personas and NPCs, northern Cardolan, southern Cardolan. We got a little bit, here's one of the smaller towns. Like I said, there's very few of them, to be truthful. Here's a colorful map. This one I looked at, I didn't take out of the book, so it's still in it. Here's the Wildwood at the south, part of Tharbad. Here's the traditional Iron Crown map for Middle-earth and the Middle-earth style. So we got the Barrow Downs running up here. Here's Bree. This is the Shire, so you can see. So northern Cardolan or southern Arthedain is somewhere right in here. There's an area that would cut off and come up like this. So this would belong to Arthedain, and this whole area here more or less belongs to Cardolan. And so we got Tharbad, and then there would be a further section to the south that's not on the map. Oh yeah, it is. Never mind. There's the other half of the map here, so to speak. The rest is Tharbad. Tharbad itself, interesting NPCs, the mercenary captains, the city plan, various structures and major landmarks, the Great Storm, area map, the ruins of Londir. The western Londir, the Arundel rejoined the mainland many years ago. Little has been revealed by the Great Hurricane and the basalt ruins of the Barnell Uningingis. So this is basically part of one of the adventures that your players can participate in. You see a number of nice little underground maps of ruins. Since the destruction of Lonadir, the port of the northern bank of the mouth of the Guantho has become the second city of Cardolan. For most of this time, the Sidori was known as the Missalad and was renamed only after the foundation of the Kingdom of Sarlane. Sidori is the capital of Sarlane, mainly because the king's most reliable revenues came from the tolls on the ships and barges that call here. Counters retain much of its old, unsavory character, playing a little part in the development of the clans of the Sarlane, within the seeming permanent residency. So this is talking about a little kingdom that arises many years after the fall of Arnor proper, and then the towns, some handful of towns, the fortresses. This is one particular couple breakdowns of some of the fortresses to be found. Other sites, other notes of interest, nice little maps. Always like that sort of stuff, right? That's real room. Caravans, gardens, and two-legged curs, treachery, and other adventures. And then we get our Master's Encounter table, Master Beast table. Like I've said in previous reviews of MERP, I've always liked the Master NPC tables. And in the past, I have Xeroxed these things. And, you know, for those of you who remember what the Xeroxing is, and bound them together in a binder because it gave me a ready list of NPCs, names and stats and equipment, basic, you know, premise if I needed to tap something in a relative hurry and I wasn't inclined to spend a lot of effort creating my own from scratch. All I had to do was do some modifications. One of the things I point out, really easy for me to do and for anybody to do, because it's a D100 system. I know that a D20 system is basically a division of 10. So I can go and look down the various individual stuff. So in this case, the individual's got a strength of 94. And I can divide 94 by 5 or by 10. And we take 94, divide by 5. This particular person would have a strength of almost 19. So if you wanted to go, technically, since he's he's an important person, it would make sense that he's a prince and he would have a high strength. But he could also have a strength of 10, which would make him average. So it's a matter of perspective. You know, in this case, he has 30 skill points in climb. I divide that by 5. That gives him 6 points of climb and 8 points of swim, so on and so forth. Not a whole lot of needed to modificate on the fly. So in this case, we have a plus 15 longsword divided by 5 makes it a plus 3. Real quick, real easy peasy, never cheesy. There you have it. The Lost Realm of Cardolan. You can get your hands on these things. They're always nice to have. No other reason than the interesting factor being to reading them.